Teaching StarCraft, Part 1, Episode 6, Zerg Mechanics. In this episode, we will be discussing the basics of the Zerg race. We will talk about how the Zerg mechanics work, the various Zerg buildings and upgrades, and also give some useful tips on how to play the Zerg. We will not be talking about Zerg units aside from the Queen. Zerg units will be discussed in the next episode. Also, as with all of these race discussion episodes, we will not talk about the exact statistics of the buildings or upgrades. Be sure to check out their exact statistics by yourself. Liquipedia should have statistics on everything we talk about in the following episodes. The Zerg. The Zerg operate a bit differently than the other two races, so you might have had a bit of trouble macroing them if you didn't just yet understand exactly how they operate. Luckily, it is not so difficult, and once you know how the Zerg work, their macro can in fact be a lot simpler than the other two races. The reason Zerg macro is fairly simple is because essentially all of its units come out of a single structure, the hatchery. The hatchery is the primary structure for the Zerg. The hatchery produces larvae roughly every 15 seconds, which can then turn into pretty much every Zerg unit in the game, given that you have the technologies for the unit. Of course, this means that the only production facility you have to build for the entire game is more hatcheries. Hatcheries also give 2 supply each. You should also know hatcheries have 2 rally points, one for drones and one for other units. This is so that you can rally drones to your mineral line and units to the front lines easily. You can also rally eggs individually. The downside to this is that the hatchery builds up larvae fairly slowly and are large expensive units, so building lots of them is generally frowned upon. That is why the Zerg has a special unit called the Queen, which is built directly out of the hatchery, not from the larvae it produces. The Queen has various abilities. The most important of these is spawn larvae or inject larvae. This allows you to inject the hatchery with larvae, causing it to spawn extra larvae after 40 seconds. You can only inject larvae once per hatchery, until that first inject is complete. It times out well because inject larva is a spell that costs 25 energy, which regenerates in almost exactly 40 seconds, which is the length of the spawn larva mechanic. Of course, if you want to macro perfectly, you will want to inject larva exactly every 40 seconds on all of your hatcheries. So although Zerg macro is simple, it is not easy. There are a few ways to inject larva quickly. One way is to use camera hotkeys. To do this, you hotkey all of your queens together, such as using the 5 hotkey here, and then use your camera hotkeys to move to your hatcheries to quickly inject larvae. Also keep in mind that if you have 3 more larvae at a single hatchery, that hatchery will stop automatically spawning larvae, so you must use the inject ability in order to spend your larvae as soon as possible. You also cannot have more than 21 larvae at a single hatchery at any point in time. It is therefore important not only to spawn larvae, but to use your larvae if you want to make use of the 21 larvae limit or the hatchery's automatic larva spawning abilities. The other special mechanic of the Zerg is creep. Creep is something that spreads along the ground around hatcheries. Zerg buildings can only be built on this creep aside from hatcheries, extractors, and nidus worms. Other races cannot build buildings on creep, but opponent Zergs can build on your creep. Zerg units also move faster on creep. Most notably, the Queen, Spinecrawler, and Sporecrawler move significantly faster on creep than off. So of course, spreading your creep is very, very important. Aside from spreading creep from hatcheries, you can also drop creep from overlords once you reach the lair technology. You can also create creep tumors using a special spell on the Queen, which costs 25 energy. Creep tumors are a special structure of the Zerg that while building are visible, but becomes burrowed when finished. Creep tumors provide vision and also spread creeps around them slowly over time. Finally, a creep tumor can replicate itself, creating a new creep tumor every once in a while. It can only do this once, but once the new creep tumor is created, it also gains a replicate ability, meaning you can create a new line of creep tumors from a single creep tumor. Also note that additional creep tumors can be cancelled while they are built from the first creep tumor. Be sure to continue to create new creep tumors as quickly as possible in order to spread your creep as quickly as possible over time. Another thing to know about the Zerg is that the Zerg workers, the drones, sacrifice themselves in order to create buildings. You can of course cancel the building to recreate the drone, but once the building is complete, the drone is gone. This means Zerg buildings actually cost 50 more minerals than it actually shows in the bottom right hand corner, since it also costs a drone as well. But it does not mean you need to hoard so many minerals to plot a new building down, since you can just use one of your existing drones to build it. It does mean you have to build a lot more drones than your opponent built workers, since you have to constantly replace the ones you turn into buildings. The last thing I want to mention is that the Zerg supply building, the Overlord, is actually a unit that can fly. It has some other abilities as well, which we will talk about in the next episode. Buildings and upgrades. The Zerg technology tree is also fairly simple. The Zerg have 3 stages of technology: hatchery technology, lair technology, and hive technology. These technologies are called such because you can upgrade your hatchery into a lair to upgrade your tier 2 technologies, and then your lair into a hive to unlock your final stage 3 technologies. The lair requires a spawning pool to be upgraded into, and the hive requires an infestation pit. Now let's talk a little bit about the buildings and upgrades of the Zerg. The hatchery is the primary structure of the Zerg and allows you to build larvae as well as queens. In addition to this, it has 3 upgrades. Burrow is an upgrade that allows all of your Zerg units to burrow underground, making them invisible and unable to be attacked unless your opponent has detection. However, Zerg burrow units cannot move or attack except for in a couple of special cases. We'll talk about these special cases in the next unit episode of the Zerg. It also has upgrades for the Overlords, which increase the Overlord movement speed and allow Overlords to transport units. The first building you're going to want to build as a Zerg is the spawning pool. The spawning pool allows you to build Zerglings. It also has upgrades for the Zerglings, which allow it to increase the movement speed of Zerglings, and once you have hive technology, the attack speed of Zerglings. Movement speed is a common ground amongst the Zerg upgrades. You'll notice that the Baneling nest, which allows Zerglings to turn into Banelings, also has a movement speed for Banelings. This is only unlocked at the lair technologies. The Roach Worm, which builds roaches, also has a movement speed for roaches, as well as a Tunneling Claws upgrade, which allows roaches to move while burrowed. This also increases their life regeneration rate while burrowed. Both of these upgrades require lair technology, but the Baneling's nest and the Roach Worm can both be built at hatchery technology. Once you have lair technology, now you can build the Hydralisk Den, which unlocks Hydralisk. The Hydralisks again have a movement speed upgrade, but this only affects them while they are off creep. Their movement speed is the same on creep and off creep if you get this upgrade. They also have a +1 range attack upgrade. Also at lair technology, you can build an infestation pit. This unlocks the hive technology and allows you to build infestors and swarm hosts. Swarm hosts can also upgrade their locusts to have an additional lifetime, and infestors, which are a spellcasting unit, can be upgraded to have a special ability called Neuroparasite, or be upgraded to start out with more energy. Finally, you can build a spire off of the lair technology. The spire allows for air units such as the Mutalisk and the Corruptor to be built, and also allows you to upgrade your air units. Once you have the hive technology, you can also upgrade it into a greater spire, which allows your Corruptors to turn into powerful broodlords. Finally, on lair technology, you have a Nidus network. The Nidus network is a special building of the Zerg. It does not create units, but what it does instead is it spreads to various locations on the map with the Nidus worm. The Nidus worm does not need to be built on creep, it only needs to be built upon vision. Once the Nidus worm is put down, it cannot be cancelled. But when it is complete, you can move units from the Nidus network into the Nidus worm. You load up units into the Nidus network, and they will automatically pop out of the Nidus worm once you choose to unload them. This allows you to transport units automatically across the map. Notice also that the Nidus worm creates free creep around it, unlike most Zerg buildings. Be aware that if you lose all of your Nidus worms and Nidus networks, any units inside the Nidus network will die off. So you have to be a little bit careful about protecting your Nidus worms and networks. Also note that when a Nidus worm is complete, it makes a roaring sound, which is heard by your opponents regardless of where you put the Nidus worm. So you have to be careful about being a little bit too sneaky or a little bit too greedy with your Nidus worms. Finally, at the Hive technology, you can unlock the Ultralis Cavern, which allows for the most powerful Zerg unit, the Ultralis, to be built. It also has an upgrade for Ultralis, which increases its armor significantly. A very, very powerful upgrade once you get to Hive technologies. The upgrades of the Zerg, in general, are built off the evolution chambers. Although there are 3 upgrades, most players only get 2 or 1 evolution chamber, because you're generally going to choose one path for the Zerg, whether it is ground range units or ground melee units. These have separate attack upgrades, but share the same armor upgrade. Again, with most of the rest of the Zerg technologies, level 1 upgrades for the Zerg are available at Hatchery technology, but level 2 and level 3 are only unlocked at Lair and Hive technologies. Finally, let's talk about the Zerg defensive structures, the Spore Crawler and the Spine Crawler. Also note that Queens, although they're generally used for their macro mechanic, are very, very powerful defensive units. Since they are not allowed to move off creep, they are generally not used for offense, and you keep them around as a defensive unit only. Now, the Spine Crawler and the Spore Crawler are attacking defensive units that attack both ground and air, depending on which one we're talking about. The Spore Crawler is a detection unit that can detect invisible units, and it also attacks air units. Notice that it has a very, very high damage versus biological air units. This is primarily useful only against Mutalisks, but it can be useful against Overlords as well. These are the only air units that are biological, so this is not too important except in the Zerg versus Zerg matchup. It also has a very high range and only attacks air. The Spine Crawler only attacks ground, but also has a very high range and a slight buff versus armored units. Also note that both the Spine Crawler and Spore Crawler can unroot and move around the map. However, they move significantly slower off creep, so it's generally a good idea to keep these guys defensive and root them on creep. They can only turn into their attacking stance in the rooted position on creep. You cannot root Spine Crawlers or Spore Crawlers off creep. However, you might want to try something like using your Overlord creep spread to allow your Spine Crawlers or Spore Crawlers to root off in key locations where you do not yet have that creep available. This is an upgrade that only comes up once you have layer technology. Also note that the rooting time is fairly long, so in general you're going to want to keep these guys rooted in key locations instead of moving them around too often. Tips. As a Zerg player, you're going to want to focus on injects and creep spread aside from your macro. Spreading a few Overlords to scout is also a good idea. Even though Overlords are the supply building of the Zerg, they are also fairly cheap and hard to kill since they are air units, especially early on. So putting 2 or 3 out there for a little more vision is generally not a bad idea. You don't want to be sending all of your Overlords out to scout, however, since losing all of your Overlords is of course a major inconvenience. Also, since you can build whatever units you want out of hatcheries, you'll want to focus on building as many drones as possible early on, since it's the most important step of your macro. Also make sure to build at least 1 queen per hatchery and use their energy as quickly as possible. It's also a good idea to get Zergling speed upgrade early along with a few Zerglings, maybe a Spine Crawler, and then focus purely on drones until you have around 40 or more workers on 2 bases or more. It's a good idea to expand very quickly as Zerg, since the hatcheries are not only your primary structure for drones, but also your production facilities for units. Finally, since you can build large waves of units at once with the larva mechanic and inject larva, it's often not a bad idea to store up some resources as Zerg along with available supply if you're about to unlock a new technology, such as the Spire or the Ultralis Cavern. Don't be afraid to build extra hatcheries in your base as well if you need more larvae. Before the next episode, practice your Zerg macro focusing on creep spread and injects. If you need to know if you're spreading creep well, you can play a game focusing only on creep spread to see how far it gets, and then try to replicate that in a real game. Most maps can be reached around half of the map with creep spread at about 12 minutes. To make sure your injects are on time, check your queen's energies every once in a while. If you are injecting correctly, each queen should have little to no energy. Also, be sure to check out Zerg streams or professional games from Zerg players. You can usually find more information about streams or professional play on teamliquid.net or on reddit.com/r/StarCraft. That's it for this episode. I'm Adon, and I'll see you next time on Teaching StarCraft. If you like teaching StarCraft, please support me by donating to my PayPal or subscribing to my YouTube channel. You can also follow me on Twitch and Twitter at twitch.tv/AdonSC and twitter.com/AdonSC. For more information and timestamps, please check the description below.